Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. Welcome, everyone. If you enjoy the show, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast listening platform and YouTube. You can now also check out the full video episode on X. Please also consider sharing your favorite episodes and leaving a review. If you do that and tag me or send me a screenshot, I will enter you in a monthly raffle for a free 30-minute consultation with me. For full episode details, including notes, timestamps, transcripts, and the show Patreon page, and other ways to support the show, please head over to my website at zachbitter.com. There you can find all my coaching services, including some new offerings for 2025. You can also sign up for my Substack newsletter, where I have been publishing my training journal weekly, as well as other topic-based posts. If you have any questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on my website or at hpopodcast@gmail.com. A big thanks to Element Electrolytes, Delta G Ketones, ProBio Nutrition, and Training Peaks for supporting the podcast. I have links and promotions to these brands in the show notes, but you can also get them here. If you want to check out Element Electrolytes, head over to drinklmnt.com/HPO. That'll get you a free sample pack with your first purchase. At deltagketones.com, if you enter promo code BITTER20, you will get 20% off your next purchase. And if you go to probionutrition.com, enter promo code ENDURANCE, and that will get you 20% off your next purchase. All right, David, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Zach. I just admire you so much. I'm probably going to be fanboying throughout this episode. I'll make sure the listeners don't have to deal with too much of it, but just love how open-minded you are. You're one of the best athletes in the world. Can't wait.
I appreciate it. It's really hard to believe it's been a year since you came on last time after crushing Leadville, and then now you're back on after crushing Leadville again, maybe further solidifying your approach to that course and the strategies that go into all of it. So I want to chat a little bit about that, but also dive into kind of your fueling strategy, some high carb input stuff and things like that, and maybe learn a little bit from you as the king of the carbs, as they say, I think.
They say that? I love that. That's what I want on my tombstone. That'll be delightful.
He exceeded any logical threshold of carbohydrate consumption. Here he lies, something like that, maybe.
Bam. Let's do it.
Awesome. How's recovery? I'm guessing is well on its way after Leadville. You feeling pretty good?
Yeah, so we're recording this a little over 4 weeks after, 4.5 weeks. I feel fantastic, actually. One of the big interventions I made this year was based on a study that came out in April, which usually I'm not the type of guy that's, a study and then do something. But this was a little bit of a different situation because it tracked two athletes who finished 32 hours in the Wasatch 100, but it looked at their metabolic rate for 7 days after the race. So like within the race, obviously they burn a ton of calories and carbs, but then after too, and their resting metabolic rate was 2 times elevated 7 days post-race. And the researchers put these numbers on paper to indicate these athletes, even though they're not doing anything, need massive calorie totals to recover. And so this year after Leadville, I basically trained like I was doing a long run every day, even as I was like shut down 5 days later, which you know intuitively, but seeing numbers on it made a huge difference. And yeah, my recovery rate has been way better than I've ever felt before. So the rare instance where I think study directly informs practice.
Yeah, I saw that study. I think I actually saw it on Instagram. I want to say one of the researchers was posting it there, and I thought that was really interesting because, yeah, to the degree that you're going to be, I think we all intuitively know, like, all right, after a 100-mile race, I should probably eat a lot for a couple of days to catch up. But you're not just catching up, you're also, like you said, possibly 2xing your resting metabolic rate, which is going to be similar to what you would normally eat on an active training week in a lot of cases. And yeah, that's a lot of food to be considering when you're not necessarily in that same space in your head, maybe of, okay, I did that workout, I better eat more. And yeah, in a week, it's pretty crazy to think about that it's got that long of a tail.
Especially because you're also making up for the deficit accrued during the race, which is huge. So that's not even and then that's on top of the RMR changes, like the resting metabolic rate. Yeah, so I applied that, came back, Bike numbers came back way more quickly than they usually do. That's the main place I saw it because I think running is sometimes a little bit more wishy-washy where so many variables go into it that you can't really tell what's what and where you're at. But biking is just it's a numbers game. And yeah, recovery is also, I think, just because last year's Leadville was my very first 100. Now that I've done that, Javelina, DNF, Western States, like I've had enough longer efforts that I've just some longer term nervous system adaptations. Plus, I think I treated my body better this year at Leadville and was able to cross the finish line feeling really good. And that went a long way too.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you do anything different nutritionally at Leadville this year? I know you were very high carbohydrate, but I think if I remember correctly, the first time you were also very high caffeine. Was that all on the table still?
Lower caffeine this time because the way I approach caffeine in races is I have a general feel for what I want to do, but then go on feel. So I don't dose caffeine too much preemptively. It's more based on like when you get a little fuzzy feeling or a little lower motivation or anything like that. And I just felt fantastic. So I maybe did 400 to 600 milligrams as opposed to way too much I did last year. And then carb wise, I did more this year than last year, just knowing what I can handle. So I was up around 150 for the grams per hour for the first 10 hours of the race and then dialed back subsequently.
Yeah, the other thing interesting I've seen with some of the stuff that gets reported, I think Western States probably does the best job I've seen of this because we just get I can't, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, they had all top 10 men and I think maybe 6 or 7 of the women that published their fueling. And there was that trend of first we were getting higher in general than what we had seen in the past, but also there was that sort of front loading effect where people were maybe pulling back a little bit near the end. Is that just when you're noticing a little more gut like processing stuff? So you're just intuitively saying, all right, it's not going on quite as smooth as it was the first 10 hours. I'm probably okay pulling back and not puking some of this up.
So that's a big part of it. But the question is what drives that, whether that's just accumulated stress or lower output. And that's
Oh,
probably
that's true. Yeah.
the main source is just every 100 miler is a fast 50 miler at the top level nowadays, the fast 50 miler followed by like attrition. My heart rate data is all shared on Leadville and I was pushing as hard as I could, but you're even before the heart rate suppression happened at the end, I was in the 130s. And at that point, 150 grams per hour is just way too much when I'm in my zone one, essentially. That's like the governor I think that sometimes people miss is that high carb only works with hard efforts or high effort. High carb doesn't work with low effort, though maybe on the bike you could do that. But the astronomical numbers we're seeing are not in ultra running where there's some jarring and the effort's lower. It's in Ironman triathlons or cycling or whatever, where the wattages are so high, the power output is so high constantly. And that's where we saw 182 grams per hour at the
Yeah.
Ironman World Championships, like just these insane numbers. But we're also seeing that in road cycling. And that's because they're maintaining very high power throughout the event. So if we ever see really high stuff in ultra running, we'll probably see it more in 6 to 8 hour events rather than a 15-hour event like Leadville or a hot event like Western States.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what that would do for the 100K, 50-mile like records and some of the more popular courses around those distances and things like that, or even like a race like Comrades to the degree that who knows what they're fueling at. Most of the top finishers at Comrades are South African still. So I don't know how often that data gets published at all. So that would be a great race for it, though. When you think of just like the winning guys are running like 5:45s on a hilly road, it's like you're putting up a lot of workload at that point. So
Yeah,
that'd be
it's
an
starting to touch everything. I don't have that many years left, I assume, at the top level, but one of the things, if I recover well from Javelina this year, is I really want to do a world record attempt because I think that there's still so much meat on those bones because of the high carb, right? Not because I'm better. I'm not better than anybody, but I think that as soon as the same cycling principles get applied there, like we're going to see the same things we've seen in cycling just because the physiology there is even more obvious than in hundreds. Because in hundreds, some people can operate on such low effort levels on certain courses that carb needs are not that high. No one's ever going to beat my time at Leadville without high carb because it's such a fast race at times that you're going to need to push unless even if you're a 210 or 208 marathoner, you're going to need to push. But there are mountain courses where that doesn't apply. The world record type stuff is all high effort. That's going to change. And you're seeing it in shorter events too. I coached Jess McLean, who just finished 8th at the World Championships in the marathon. And probably a lot of her growth has been high carb. At Boston this year, she was over 100 grams per hour, and she's a small person at very high effort levels, and she ran 222 for top American on a tough course. And that is, so it's starting to interact with physiology across the board in running, and it's super exciting because I think it's also going to change training theory with it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Jess because I knew you had been working with her, and we're getting into that distance where fueling is still obviously a piece to the puzzle, but maybe not to the same degree from or a smaller amount. I guess the way to maybe look at it would be like your internal reserves are just going to be a little higher percentage of what you could possibly get away with versus a Leadville, that's a very tiny fuel tank. But then you ratchet up intensity closer to lactate threshold, and now all of a sudden 2 hours and 20 minutes you're going to have some carb, but you're saying she's up 100 plus grams per hour even during a marathon?
Yeah, she's 105, 110 as a very small person. The counterintuitive part of this is that in road marathons, it probably matters less for Jess than it does for your 3.5 hour marathoner for that exact reason you talked about. Is if that 3.5 hour marathoner is pushing to the top of their potential at that moment, they're operating on a lower tank of reserves to begin with, or a lower tank to access later on. Yeah, I think as the longer you go, the more it matters. But the wild part of this equation is it's not just a glycogen reserve tank question. Like the most eye-opening thing to me was the Olympics in the mountain bike, which is a 1 hour event. And I saw the athlete that won the gold medal for women, taking a gel 6 minutes before the finish after taking them. It's okay. Like you're seeing that across the board when there's tons of data, even in these short events. And so, yeah, probably it has a lot to do with the nervous system and how the brain regulates performance more even than how the body responds, which is like the biggest frustrating thing, like following some of the lower carb zealots who say, well, you're not actually oxidizing those carbs you're taking in. It's not just an oxidation question, though clearly
Right.
that plays a role. It's a nervous system question. And I think anybody who actually plays the game or coaches athletes who play the game, like when you feel that firsthand, it's just, oh my God, this is why the game is changing. But you kind of have to feel it sometimes or really be empathetic to other people's experiences to truly understand why it's becoming such like a movement beyond what seems reasonable from some of the current data that you might see in control studies.
Just a quick reminder that Pro Nutrition is my go-to supplement for all my electrolytes and digestive needs. The reason I like it is it was developed by my good friend, Dr. Mark Bubbs. He has had a lot of experience working with successful individuals that have busy, active lifestyles, including Olympians, NBA basketball players, professional hockey players. One of the things he noticed was a lot of supplements were not only mislabeled, but not very effective. So he went about to try to lower the friction point there by making it as easy as having one scoop of ProBio Nutrition every day. I will take it with either water, smoothie, or mix it in with my yogurt once per day, and then I'm done. And I can rest at ease knowing that along with a good diet, I'll have all those micronutrients and digestive needs met. Head over to probionutrition.com and enter promo code endurance for 20% off your next order. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that when you were, and I do want to get in kind of like your transition into this in terms of just what you did to, there's steps, I'm assuming, to get to 150 grams
Yeah.
per hour. I can appreciate this is going to be hard to quantify, but was there some sort of like trend where you're like, okay, when I do 60, I feel like this, but I get a little bit of extra when I go to 70, 80. Is it a pretty noticeable as you increase, or is there like because I think of it like with training where you get like a lot of progress up to say maybe 70 miles, and then you get some more progress from 70 to 100, but it's not going to be as free of an exchange as it was. And then you start getting a little riskier as you go beyond that, where you're paying quite a bit for some small returns.
Yeah.
Is it similar to that with adding more carbohydrate, or are you getting more of a linear, like the more I can get in, the better I feel, and it just keeps going up?
Yeah, definitely. The dose response relationship is very individual and it follows some sort of, you're going to hit an asymptote probably. And the question, what I find is that wholly shift the curve, like upward shift the curve of that asymptote when you realize this is just letting me push harder. And
Mhm.
when you view it like that, so my personal experience with it is I thought, so I went to college to play football as a big guy, and endurance was never my forte at baseline. It took me a long time to work into all these sports. And eventually, when I found my way to 50K after 8 years of running, I got to the finish line, cramping, feeling terrible. And that was my experience in 50Ks where I had some success, but every single 50K, I could not have imagined going 51K. And then took a break from racing at a very top level, even though I was training really hard all the time because I didn't want to race athletes I coach, professional male athletes I coach from like 2016 to 2023. And Megan was like, David, you got to race. You're getting older. Like, you're never going to have a shot unless you do it now. I got over my weirdness with athletes. And then from there, like, started doing some longer ultras. And by then, high carb had hit the cycling peloton. It had hit my coaching as much as I can, but not the extremely high carb. And just at the beginning, like 75 grams, like that's I think the beginning of the high carb funnel. All of a sudden I was like, oh, I do have some endurance to call on. And then at 90 grams, I'm like, all right, I stopped cramping up as much. At 100 grams, 115, 120, I'm like, I don't cramp at all anymore. And then at 120 plus, I'm like, I can push hard. I can run 550 miles at the start of the Leadville 100 and be okay. And basically, for people out there that are wondering, it's 75 grams is where it starts on harder efforts. None of this is saying do this on easy days or like random training days. And that will get you probably 80% of the way there for most people. And that's, I say most people can probably stop at 75 and not sweat it. And 90 is like the peak, like the absolute max. And if you go above 90, you probably need to also not just be pushing hard, but also have higher output. Like, you probably don't want to be doing 120 at 12-minute miles for the same reason that cyclists wouldn't do that at 150 watts, even if 150 watts is their functional threshold power.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think it is interesting when you start looking at just workload and what that ends up like looking and the control events are fun with that too, because you get if you run a steady enough race or relatively steady enough race, it almost gets easier because now you're applying these numbers to something that's very consistent versus a course like Leadville where you've got stretches of downhill, stretches of uphill, and pacing gets a little or pace per mile gets a little murky in there in terms of what you're actually producing from a metabolic standpoint. But yeah, that's really helpful. I know like so I've been doing high carb now. I think I'm on week 11 of just like the dietary shift. And I've done enough long runs now too, where I've been hitting a lot of that carbohydrate during the longer runs, and I'm getting up to 80 to 100 grams in some of those, and 2 to 3 hours. So the big question obviously is okay, that's great, but can you keep doing that for 10, 11, 12 hours? And hopefully the answer is yes. But I suspect it's something that takes a lot of work and practice with in terms of just getting myself digestively ready for that. So I do.
To
Go
cut
ahead.
you off, I know most of your listeners understand that, and I've read your articles on it. But just to, so if people are coming into this and this is their first exposure to it, how have you noticed the shift, or in those runs, how has it felt for you?
Yeah. So I would say I can give you kind of like a little breakdown of just how everything has felt with it so far, because you might be interested or have some feedback for me just in general. But I would say a couple things really were interesting right out the gate was I started sleeping like 30 to 60 minutes per night less,
Mm,
but no sign of, oh, I'm like struggling because of it. It wasn't like, oh, I can't sleep and I want to sleep. It was like I'm just getting up earlier
yeah,
and ready to start. Caffeine consumption came down about half of what I was taking in before. For whatever reason, it's just like my typical routine prior was I'd have a cup of coffee before my morning workout, and then I'd come back in the afternoon, and then I'd have another cup of coffee like in the late morning. And now it's like I have that first cup of coffee with probably about 60 to 70% the amount of caffeine in it than it would before. And then I'm just done. I don't even touch
yeah.
it for the rest of the day. I have no desire to either. In fact, it seems like undesirable to add another stimulant into the mix. So that's been two things that I'm seeing as like pretty big positives. With the way I've been describing it is performance feels better pretty much across the board from like easy runs all the way up to like short intervals. And I've got really good data on some of the short interval stuff that I can compare to. The most like eye-opening one is I have this hill that I'll use for hill intervals, and it's about a quarter mile long. It's 9 to 10% incline. And I've done almost 200 reps on that from workouts over the last few years. I did an 8 by that hill, and I had my 8 fastest reps up that hill. Not one of them being my fastest. All 8 of them are faster than my prior fastest one. And I only do that workout on perceived effort. I don't watch data while I'm doing it. I just go and I say, okay, this is the effort I'm hitting for this one. And then I dial it up and I go and look at the data afterwards. So like that was a pretty big eye opener. The interesting thing I find too is just like low carb is really durable in the sense that like my perceived effort and my paces don't change much, where once I get into it, it's okay, I can expect what's going to happen and it's really predictable. And any change is like a really slow degradation. Whereas with high carb, I feel like it's just a lot more touchy.
Yeah.
So like I feel like maybe an urge to run faster than I'd want to at times. And I have to make sure, okay, the goal here is to be here. Don't go faster than that. Or all of a sudden I'll be like, oh, I feel like I'm working way harder at the same pace. And some of that's just, I think, the fueling demand inputs too, where if the run's long enough or hard enough, if my perceived effort starts rising at a given pace, and so yeah, hit a gel, and then it usually goes away. Or the other one I noticed on shorter runs, if I do just like a stride, it usually recalibrates then too. That would be the kind of the general take I've had on it so far. I haven't done anything beyond 3 hours yet. So in terms of just testing how my gut's going to respond to it with the fueling input, that's an unknown, but I'm doing a 12-hour on October 25th. So I'll get a really good look at how that spans out to a longer duration at that
I
point.
can't wait. So I think the tricky part, to be devil's advocate against my own position, is that your fat oxidation rate is going to be sky high for the rest of your life.
Do you think so? You think I'm going to maintain that?
Oh yeah. I haven't been to a lab to measure it, but my fat oxidation rate's sky high. And so that's the complicated thing is usually when athletes train adequately, they have good fat oxidation rates. You have pushed that to another level, right? Like beyond that. But and that does seem like it is durable and lasts a long time. So I think you're going to get the best of all worlds and it's going to be freaking awesome. But similarly, I came of age in the low carb era. It's not like I didn't do any concerted low carb, but I did plenty of runs where I just went out and ran and I never thought about any of this stuff. I don't know if I ever had a gel for the first like 6 or 8 years of my running. And so I think for male athletes in particular, that can be a tricky element because fat oxidation rates are trainable and do move. And for female athletes, the risk of low carb is so high that you got to be way more careful because like female athletes get destroyed. Male athletes are much more durable with that because the endocrine system is less touchy and less at risk. But that's the one place that I think some complications can arise.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you think like I'm going to have to go in and get my fat oxidation rate test. I'm getting a blood draw done, I think next week, Friday too, because I'm going to be curious to see what that looks like as well, just in general. More so due to I'm doing this with like certain food groups, right? Like I'm trying to get high carb, but I'm not being super picky about what that means. But there's probably optimization I can do within that where it's maybe if you're low on this, eat that instead of that sort of a thing, just to get an idea there. But yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see like the fat oxidation rates and see. I assume they've dipped to some degree just based on the dietary shift, but yeah, maybe I retain more and I'm still like pretty high, relatively speaking, compared to the average endurance athlete.
Oh, for sure. And they don't need to be that high. Like they just need to be high enough. And I think that the part that is just the uncomfortable conversation that the low carb people don't have is like fat oxidation rates mostly, and what we're talking about there is just aerobic fitness. And so a lot of people that come into this, it's not Zach Bitter top of the end of the sport. It's people that are just not training enough. You train a little bit more and you don't have to hack your nutrition. You can eat. And that's not to say that there's not a place for lower carb at times. Like for me, it's always a training discussion, not a life discussion. And I think a lot of athletes listening to this that aren't like trying to set 100-mile records or whatever, for them, it's outside of training, like in your evening or whatever. You can totally practice that, and that's okay. We're not trying to have a constantly full glycogen take all the time, and you're fighting, because a study just came out on glycogen loss and replenishment, which had athletes do 2-hour protocols on the bike where they're glycogen depleting, where there's 2 hours of 2-minute intervals essentially to basically failure, very hard stuff. And then one group did 10 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. So huge carb totals afterwards in the 12 hours. And one group did a placebo. And even the group that did 10 grams per kilogram of body weight did not replenish their muscle glycogen in 12 hours, which points out why elite athletes, it's okay, outside of training, high carb makes a huge difference too, because you're training all the time. Otherwise, you'd be at zero constantly as that adds up.
Yeah.
But for everybody else, some of that matters, but I'm not one that's throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are health thoughts that go outside of just the training context. But while training, you burn the shit, and that's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so basically, I think sometimes people are like, you're going to talk about type 2 diabetes. It's nah, that's not at all backed by science. The problem is, like, if people say, me saying high carb is saying, now go eat pixie sticks for 14 hours of your day outside of training after your 4 mile run. It's not like that at all.
Yeah. You have to compare similar populations when you're talking about that stuff, I think. So just a quick reminder, Training Peaks is one of the best tools for monitoring your training progress and my go-to tool when coaching individuals. At Training Peaks, you can get deep into the data, assess training load, recovery, and easily monitor progress across all training intensities. It is a perfect example of a program that takes much of the guesswork out of your training and coaching experience. I really love assessing intervals on Training Peaks. One of the first things I'll do when I get back from a run is I'll hop onto Training Peaks, unpack all that data, and just see how each of those individual intervals went and really dive into where I could maybe improve in the future. So if you're interested in getting deeper into your own training data, head over to trainingpeaks.com. You look at that study, I think it was probably almost a year and a half ago, where they had, I'd just be curious for your thoughts. So I think it was either 10 or 20 endurance athletes. I think they described them as elite athletes, which I think, like, we get really weird with definitions in this, because if you think of like sport elite athlete, like none of these individuals were training at any caliber like what we'd see at the world championships right now. But relative to the average person, they were probably training quite a bit. I think it was like maybe something in the neighborhood of 30 or 40 miles per week or something like that.
Yeah.
And 3 out of the 10 participants on the high carb without weight gain had pre-diabetic levels of fasting blood glucose level. And I was following that conversation afterwards, and there's some interesting back and forth. And one was like, yeah, but not all pre-diabetic blood glucose levels actually turn into diabetes. There's like a percentage of the population that their baseline sort of is in that pre-diabetic range, and they just don't ever progress to anything dangerous. So that opens up a whole nother can. Even if we look at that study and take like the people who really buy into it for their word and say, okay, maybe 3 out of 10 people are better off with a lower carb, or maybe not, at least not a really high carbohydrate diet, we would have to square that with whatever percentage of the population maybe just stabilizes just fine at a little higher resting blood glucose level.
Oh, yeah. It's such a scientifically disingenuous argument, unfortunately, when people start using resting blood glucose to make these types of determinations, because when the body mobilizes glycogen constantly for training, it can cause slight transient elevations that do not have any subsequent effects on health, and in fact are probably associated with better health, because the alternative would be under-fueling training and everything bad that happens there. There's definitely overdoing it. At the core of all this, the principle is fuel the work you are doing, not overfuel the work you are doing. Though there's a place for overfueling. And for elite athletes, it's impossible to overfuel, basically. And so that's why the conversation gets really simple when I talk to the professional. But if someone's doing 30 miles a week, it's still possible to overfuel the work you're doing by a ton. Yeah. I could do that easily. I'm a huge, I love that stuff. And that's fine in moderation, but you're still a human, and we're still playing chemical equations. And so you need to be a little bit careful. But I think sometimes those conversations just get convoluted, because if you look at the discussions online, I have stopped weighing in for the most part outside of on our podcast, because they're just so disingenuous. You're talking to believers, to dogmatic presenters of data, which is why I love your approach. I think both of us are like, low carb is pretty magical at times, like what it can do to the body. And it has the principles of it have a place, but that is not saying that it is a religious experience or dogma. And oh my God, like there was this study that came out January, something like that this year. And it's been constantly, it received so much media attention too. And it was like the 10 grams per hour study, and it was like maybe one of the least like scientifically honest presentations of or interpretations of data. The data itself was great, but we did a whole breakdown of it on our podcast, which we never do, where we're like, This is why this study is taking good data and turning it into and churning it
Yeah.
through their belief system. Basically, it just showed that human metabolism is miraculously flexible, but metabolic flexibility does not indicate good health or peak performance.
Yeah, my takeaway from that study was that even if you're on a strict ketogenic diet, some carbohydrate introduction is going to be worthwhile from a performance standpoint.
Yeah,
So
it's
like
the
I
opposite
found
of that.
because when people reach out to me all the time about low carb ketogenic, and some of them are like not just low carb like I was, where I'm periodizing some carbohydrate in there. They're like strict keto, and they're like 50 grams or less per day for a variety of different reasons. Generally not training anywhere near the capacity I am, but they're following that dietary approach, and they want to know what should I eat on race day. And it's that study is at least 10 grams of carbohydrate because we know that's going to move your performance. And then the other thing is like, what about 20 grams? What about 30 grams? What about 40 grams? And we get into that sort of murky water, like you were talking about before, about what is the pace and the intensity and everything like that, too. There's a nice follow up to that study that would look at these ketogenic runners and see maybe they get an even better bump by going up to 20 grams. We don't know because they stopped at 10. Because I'd be interested in that as well and to give some information towards that.
Yeah, and just simply, we have this playing out in the real world all the time from not just the front of the packs. I get what 10 messages a day from people that are like, "Oh my gosh, I always thought I couldn't go farther than whatever the distance is, 5K, 10K,
Yeah.
50 miles, whatever." And all of a sudden these athletes are like, "And now I just finished like a 200 mile or something crazy like that." I think, and it makes sense. I mean, if you just view it intuitively, this is all playing equations with how the body functions. And fat is a great substrate, but it's a low intensity substrate. And everyone out there, like it takes insane aerobic economy to be burning fat consistently. And to do it over ultras is especially difficult because the body starts substrate switching even at very low effort levels, even for aerobically economical athletes, unless they're absolute beasts like Zach. And that's where that's a great example actually is Kilian Jornet. The only time this data has really been published is in UTMB 2022, where they measured him throughout the race at like halfway or maybe 2/3 of the way. They pricked him for blood lactate. Kilian, maybe one of the most aerobically efficient athletes that has ever lived, probably has fat oxidation that's higher than ever measured. His blood lactate levels were in the double digits, which is indicative of a metabolic framework that is heavily burning glucose, like insanely burning glucose, even though he's like going at a low effort and so economical. The point just being the body gets crazy and metabolic flexibility turns into just a shitstorm of creativity. And most of it requires carbs, basically, no matter what you do in advance.
Yeah, the Killian stuff was interesting. I remember seeing that kind of role. Like he's interesting in general too, because it seems like he is able to tolerate quite a bit of carbohydrate without maybe training his gut as much as someone like you do.
Yeah, and he also takes in a ton of fat during races. Like he'll do olive oil. It's why it's always hard to take data from the best of the outliers of the outliers. He was the chosen one from the time he was 16. And it's sometimes, oh, interesting. How does that apply to human physiology generally? And then also
Right.
interesting, how is that just a goat being a goat?
Right.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's most
He's
of
just
what
one
you
individual too.
that's most of what you learn. And it's one reason that I think my story resonated a little bit is like people that have followed my journey understand that, yes, I am gifted, but I have also, it took me 18 years to have a breakthrough. This wasn't something that was as a football player. Like it took time. And as a result, it's like, there's a little bit more of an analogy to someone that is a grinder, that is trying to find every little way their body can adapt. And most likely my freakness relates to the GI system. Like I assume that my ability to take in carbs is not just something that is trained, it is probably something that is good for me or that is my super skill, right? And it might be even related to that. I was a football player. I was 200 pounds when I was young. So my body was taking in a lot of fuel. And maybe if you put me in an ultrasound or autopsy me after I pass away and have that epitaph we talked about, you'd see a GI system that's made for an offensive lineman. Who knows? But basically, like we all have our gifts. And I think that's why the high carb funnel doesn't start at 120. It starts at 75.
Yeah, that's
And
a great point. Yeah.
most people will see just insane benefits. If you're listening out there, if you do 75 grams of carbs per hour and if you've been doing 40 as most people and you go up double that, yeah, it's just bonkers.
Yeah, yeah. So when you came back to, okay, I'm going to start focus on racing again, and had you already been like, all right, the way I'm going to do this is high carb, or did you learn that once you started getting going again as, okay, this is an input I'm going to really try to leverage?
So just the unfortunate for other people reality that I have is that coaching, I get to see all of this play out. I had seen athletes like winning the biggest races in the world with very high carb behind the scenes, and especially athletes who hadn't shown it before. Like Jess McLean, she's a superstar. Like discard that data point. Instead, I'm talking about athletes that are like good but not national class or whatever, and then win a national championship, qualify for Team USA. And I was seeing these anecdote, and then the studies that were coming in, and then talked to the professional cyclists and the professional cycling coaches, where this conversation has been done and dusted. Like no one's talking about it anymore. It's just such obviously the answer. And it was like, okay, clearly this is the thing. So when I started moving up in distance, it was with that in mind. But in my first longer ultra I did at the Canyons 100K, I had not adequately GI trained and went from first place to vomiting on the trail due to some logistical issues. But then also just like after that, I was like, oh, right on. This is a equation about how to make this intake tolerable more now for me than the question of whether the intake is the right path. And so that's where the GI training started to become a bigger part of it. And now I don't really need to do that much GI training, I think, because I've adapted to it. But that was the initial thing. And then from there, basically every ultra I've done since has been awesome, except for like every longer ultra has been awesome except for Western States, which was again, I learned the high carb lesson one more time, which was had some GI issues, which were caused by hydration errors, and then had to back off carbs. And as soon as I back off carbs, it was like Superman lost all of his powers. It was like, it was, for me, it was another reminder of, oh shit, this literally is the source of everything I'm able to accomplish. Training too and working hard, but like without it, I am who I was. That nothing changed. I'm just who I was plus high carb.
Yeah, I think I found the Western States thing, like, obviously I didn't find it funny that you had a rough day, but I thought it funny the conversation afterwards because like it did come up. You got all. It was just so public that you're
Yeah.
going to hear everything that could possibly get said, and it was like, oh, maybe it does. Maybe this doesn't work. Maybe that doesn't work. Maybe this approach is wrong. So let's just zoom out for a second here. And what's the expectation for the average ultra runner in terms of nailing a race? And I guess now we have hindsight of Leadville too. It's like you've nailed 3 out of 400 milers. That's pretty good success rate. I'll take 3 out of 4 all day, every day. If you told me, all right, the next you're gonna do 400 milers, you're gonna nail 3 of them, one of them you're gonna implode, I'd sign on the dotted line immediately. Give me that implosion for those 3 nailed ones. Heck, I'd probably do it for 2,
To be
maybe even
fair,
1, depending how fast that one was. Like,
I ate shit. And so I went through the same calculus. And for the commentators out there, especially the ones that are like the shitty people on the internet, like they don't know and they don't know anything,
right.
right? Like I'm a world class coach too. I did the same thing. It's like that was a data point to learn from. When I learned some training lessons about things I had maybe changed, especially the heat suit stuff, I definitely overdid. And I think that does not work in the context of my life. And you learn stuff like that in training. That's the fun part. Like it wouldn't be an experiment if you knew how it was going to end. And I do lots of experiments, even now that I've done this. And I rolled back some of them after that. But the main thing is just look, the hard part now about racing at the top level is for an athlete like me that is not one of the gifted, like immediate superstars, right? I'm gifted, but I'm not one of those people that can have the me of 2016 that was really good would never be able to finish 100 milers. So as soon as you took away the high ability to get in as many gels, like I had to go down, I think, to 75 grams or so an hour. I didn't have to, but I did to try to troubleshoot. Like I felt all the things I used to feel. And it's, oh, if I get another shot at this, and Leadville was not the plan initially, but it's like, if I get another shot at this, the only rule I'm going to have is that no matter what happens, no matter what you think about your GI system, you are going to take in a gel every 20 minutes for 10 hours. And That's what Leadville was an experiment in. And I'll let other people talk about the historical context of this year's Leadville. It obviously hasn't resonated as much on an like international news level because of last year. It already happened. Who cares about the second time? It's 14 minutes faster than that, and with probably worse fitness. So I think it's just an interesting, being an athlete's an interesting story because you never really know what causes what. You're always just grasping at straws.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts with the 100 milers, that's for sure. And it is easy to grasp the one thing a person is maybe a little more known for and look at that and like just nitpick that specific thing. And when in reality, it's like, yeah, there's 100 other things that could derail a race outside of just your nutrition intake. So it's good to hear the whole story and things like that with most of this. Just a quick reminder that Element Electrolytes is my go-to electrolyte source. I know that I lose 614 milligrams of electrolytes for every liter of sweat. So on those training sessions, especially the hot days, I'll make sure I have a packet of one of their multiple flavors in with my fluids. Or if I'm looking for a refreshing post-workout beverage or just staying on top of electrolytes throughout the day, I will often lean to their cans of Element Sparkle, which are a very tasty treat after a hot training run. If you want to get a free sample pack with your next purchase, head over to drinklmnt.com/HPO. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask too is like, do you have just based on the people you've worked with and yourself and
Mhm.
just everyone you've talked to around this, is there like a number of grams per carbohydrate per hour? You're like, that's a pretty safe bet for that person to be able to do, even if they don't do gut training. And then beyond that, we need to start implementing some of these training protocols.
So for everybody, I think anyone listening could probably get in 75 grams an hour. Unless I think one exception actually is if people have disordered eating histories, sometimes there are psychological, like nervous system. I don't want to say psychological like a brain, but like some sort of mouth gut connection or mouth brain connection. Who knows exactly that there can be issues. And a lot of athletes use dietary restriction, including low carb, as a way to have disordered eating without having it based in certain things. One thing I always ask athletes is if you have any dietary restriction, which totally supported no matter what they are, but always trace it back to when it began and really honestly ask yourself, was I in a disordered place at that stage? And if so, that doesn't mean you need to get rid of it. It just means, you need to think about it, work with a specialist, that sort of thing. So that's one exception. But short of that, almost everybody can do 75 grams an hour with minimal training. The thing, you just need good products. That's where we have an advantage that previous generations didn't. If you're trying to take in not to disparage them, but I'm not going to say any gel companies, but an older gel style, 20 grams or 25 grams and viscous, that's hard. But nowadays you have something like a Science and Sport Beta Fuel gel where you can just like down the whole thing and it's 40 grams and so easy. What is that? You could take 140-gram gel every 40 minutes with 16 ounces of sports drink, and that gets you to 75 grams an hour, basically, something like that. So beyond that, most male athletes or most larger female athletes in larger bodies can do 90 grams because body size does matter a little bit, not a huge amount because most of our GI systems are basically the same, but it matters a little bit. And once you start going over 75 grams for a very small bodied person or over 90 grams for just about everybody, GI training should probably be a part of it because at that point, the actual load becomes high. Like the amount that you're putting into your stomach becomes high. And there are some people that don't need to do any of it, but above 90, I think it's basically universal that you need to practice not just your fueling strategy. That's not GI training. I think GI training needs to be your fueling strategy and then some.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I think, yeah, that is a really interesting point with the product availability now, because that was one of the things I was the most interested in. Because when I did low carb the first time, it was 14 years ago. So it's like none of this stuff was in the market when I initially was like, you know what, I need to find a different path forward here. And yeah, I wonder if I would have had a different experience had I been using like some of like Science and Sport or Precision stuff back then in terms of me feeling, oh, 80 grams doesn't feel too bad. I think I can maintain that. So that has been interesting now too, is like playing around with some of that stuff and kind of how smooth it can go down
It's
when
wild.
you're
It's just wild. That's our big advantage. I wish I could go back in time and tell Matt Carpenter, who had the Leadville record and has the highest VO2 max ever recorded by a runner,
yeah.
if I could give him some of these products, that's it. That one thing. That's why we partner with the feed. Give them a plug that they didn't ask for. But if we could give him these products that we have just with that, I think he would break 15 hours at Leadville if he was focused
Yeah.
on it like he was when he did it, just because like he was grinding up power bars and putting them in a thing of water. It's just so easy now. And I think a lot of people just, they had initial experiences with the older products. And now it's, this shit is so, you take it and you're like, oh, okay, this is like consuming space age technology. It's made
Right.
to,
Yeah.
you'll literally feel better in 30 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, I think it was 2014, maybe, or maybe it was even earlier than that. I was out at Western States, and Nick Clark he had a few years where he was like around third, fourth place. So I'm just going for it this year. And he had this idea of just taking in, I think he was going to try to take in 60 gels or something like that, amongst other things. And he's, yeah, I'm going to take the gels, I'm going to put in my bottles. And his gut blew up. And I remember that was just back then, it was all word of mouth for the most part.
Yeah.
And it's just, you see that and you're like, oh, okay, don't do that. But nowadays, the products you have, that is pretty much the path forward, is get the right types of products lined up and hit the totals you're looking for.
Yeah. Now, the people that really came along and reshaped it is like Jim Walmsley was high carb before anybody talked about high carb. I remember writing an article that he was, I think, doing 450 calories per hour. We talked about calories per hour back then, not grams of carbs, but he's better than anybody that's ever lived. He's just next level. But one of the first things he discovered is that. And that's probably because he was also talking
Follow
to
cyclists.
boom, you talk to cyclists. And that's why that's where the conversations are most interesting is what happens when dozens of people are like dozens of scientists are putting food on the table with athlete performance. It's like that's why the discussions online sometimes are so like interesting because I almost am just curious. I'm like, where is your example? Like, where is your success story? And there's even some prominent triathlon coaches that are still hanging on to like they're like dinosaurs hanging on to whatever, it just antiquated approaches. And I'm like, look, dinosaurs, the asteroid has already hit. And that doesn't mean athletes can't have success. Like you can have
Right.
some success because there are freaks out there, but it's just not the path. And that doesn't mean like fasted running doesn't have a place, particularly for some male athletes and stuff like that. There are nuances, but you put everybody on a start line and say your life depends on it. I think even those low carb researchers would probably be stealing some science and sport beta fuel gels.
At least 10 grams of it, right?
Yeah, yeah, dude. No, my thing is if they actually had to put food on the table with athletic performance, they'd be doing high carb almost immediately. And that's the part that I'm always like most intrigued by is everyone that is truly like has no backup plan, like in any sport. And it's just like nowadays, it's just they're all in on it as soon as they can because they see what happens really quickly.
Yeah. So when you start getting up above 75 to 90 grams, how much are you paying attention to like what the product is at that point? Are you looking for certain ratios in terms of the different types of carbohydrate sources you can get?
Yeah. So I'm sure all the listeners know, but the gut has transporters of different types of carbs. So you're looking at glucose fructose ratios, and
Mhm.
the exact ratios they probably matter a good bit. But for me, Science and Sport Beta Fuel has been the go-to, which is 1 to 0.8 ratio, glucose to fructose. The 2 to 1 is like Enervit style gels. And I know cyclists have had success with that. I've had a little less success. So I'm more of like the 1 to 0.8 ratio with that. In reality, all I really found is like I need to have practiced with a specific gel and less so with the sports drink. So I'll do whatever's on course for the sports drink at any race I do. And then because like it's basically all similar enough. But with the gel itself, so much of it comes down to the consistency, viscosity, and your body's ability to take it in without rejection that I think it does matter. And so I always urge athletes that if you're going very high, 2 to 1 ratios might still overwhelm gut transporters, especially if you're going like 140, 150 and beyond, the crazy stuff, which probably no one listening to this should do. Like literally, like you would be, like, unless you're a professional athlete, don't even mess with that because that could have risks. Like that actually could have health risks that we don't know about. Like I'm always cautious because we don't know yet. But I think 2 to 1 might be a little bit more risky at the very high levels. But at 120 and below, it's probably either of those ratios is good.
Okay. Interesting. I want to just dive a little bit into just how you're practicing with this too, like from a frequency standpoint.
Mhm.
Because you mentioned too that I found interesting. Since you've done this now a while, you feel like you can maybe get away with a little less of it because your body has more or less determined, hey, I can tolerate these high amounts. I don't need to be hitting them. Okay, maybe let me just back up and say this in a
Yeah.
way that makes sense. Take me, who hasn't been doing this, versus you, who has. Is there something where I should be thinking about, like, from a frequency per week to catch up to where I'll be able to get to my maximum intake at? Should I be like doing gut training during like interval sessions during long runs? Is there like a certain number of days per week you like to see, or is there anything
Yeah.
specific there?
For someone like you, so the way I would approach it is you're the perfect case study because quality long run, I would do the top end of your reasonable fueling range, which you said was 100 grams earlier. So I would do and just stick there. But that to me is not GI training. That's more like getting the adaptation benefits from it. And then on your other quality sessions, I would also try to be within your high carb range. So for you, 80, let's say. So like
Mm-hmm.
on your workouts, on your easy runs, don't need to think about it particularly. You might take in 10, 20, 30 grams, something like that, for the same reasons that the study said, but you don't need to worry about it. The places where real specific gut training would be relevant for you is with your cycling or things like that. So what I found with athletes is that the best place to do what I call gut training requires athletes going beyond what their top end range usually would be. So for you, going to 120, let's say, or a little more, would be on the bike, where you can do it in a setting without the pounding, so you can really work the gut in a specific sense. And this actually comes from an observation I had very early on in coaching, back when athletes weren't fueling crazy. But that's that Nordic skiers in particular and cyclists, when they come over to running, very rarely had GI issues. And I think the reason is because in those sports, they'll often have massive quantities of food all at once. Like a cyclist that does a coffee shop ride will have a big meal or whatever. Like they just
Yeah,
don't think
yeah.
about it. So they're training their guts in that way. So for us, it's an opportunity. If an athlete doesn't have cycling, aiming to do some session, like a quality long run above, or a quality like effort above what you're going to do once every week or 2 weeks, maybe, rather than doing it all the time. And the gut turns over fast, responds fast. You don't need to do it too much. But yeah, like that. So going a little bit beyond, plus using fluid to train gut tolerance of volume. So the way I like to frame it is taking in all of your fluid needs, your hourly fluid needs at once. So let's say you're taking in 24 ounces of fluid at 1 hour of your run or 45 minutes of your run. Take in 24 ounces of your electrolyte drink because you need to have balanced electrolytes. You don't want to do this with plain water. Could be rough. But if you do it all at once and then continue running, you'll actually train your gut to deal with the bloated, quote unquote, bloated feeling. And some great studies on this that show rapid changes in how athletes process it. And that those two interventions, especially the fluid one, is the big one. And the fluid one, interestingly, comes from the world of competitive eating, where so in 2023 is I need to solve this problem. This has not been solved in ultra running yet, as far as I'm aware. How do we solve it? Competitive eaters, they can't just eat hot dogs in the same way we don't want to eat tons of gels all the time. They use fluids in a large sense to train their stomach to handle increased volume. And so it stands to reason that we can probably do the same. And some studies back that up.
Just a quick reminder that Delta G ketones is my go-to exogenous ketone source. I will take these after my big training sessions as well as during my long runs at lower intensity and longer races at lower intensity. You can get 20% off your next purchase by going to deltagketones.com and entering promo code BITTER20. Yeah, that was one of the kind of anecdotes that I remember floating around in the early days when I first got it. Not that I was there at the early days of ultra running, but my early days of ultra running, where people would say, yeah, when you get closer to the race, maybe eat a meal before one of your long runs or just train your body to be. I think that the reasoning back then was just like trying to normalize the discomfort so that it didn't feel like as shocking on event day. But it seems like you're saying, like, to a degree, it's just going to make it feel normal to have your normal fueling strategy in place versus it being like something where you have to just learn to tolerate uncomfort.
Yeah, the gut and the gut brain connection are both trainable in extreme ways. The gut lining in the cells in the gut turn over so fast, and there's epigenetic like history within those cell lines. That's why an athlete like me probably doesn't need to do it that much, is that epigenetic change, like the environmental switches being turned on from this in a place where you probably have a little catching up to do. And, but once that happens, it's fantastic. And same goes with gut brain connection, which is extremely powerful, and one that maybe some of our friends with eating disorder histories struggle with a little bit more than others. So yeah, it's such a little understood place of like scientific literature, though are some good studies. Thus, it really becomes about what are athletes doing in the field. And that's where coaching gave me this immense advantage, because I get these data points from world-class athletes and then see how it works, and then can use myself as a guinea pig to just practice at the edges and the margins and be going the next step. And before Western States, I tried to go the next step, and I realized, oh shit, I actually stepped over the edge. That was
One
not
step too far.
yeah. But
Well,
like,
now you know where the edge is.
yeah, and I feel like if anything, that should be for people that are being critical. That's just an affirmation of the scientific process, especially that I went back to Leadville after, because there are, when you experiment like that, like especially with this type of question, there's just so many moving parts and inputs. We don't know what's what.
Yeah. So Javelina, that's coming up pretty quick here. You getting
Yeah,
excited, I'm guessing?
very excited. Laying low, laying low. I'm just telling you. Mentioned in passing, but not doing a YouTube series this time.
No YouTube series.
I didn't tell
Yeah,
anybody about Leadville. No one knew about Leadville other than Megan.
yeah, you snuck in that one. That was definitely a little quieter as someone who was
Yeah.
following your journey throughout. So are you, maybe you haven't decided yet, but is Javelina a path to Western States for you to go back?
Unsure. To be 100% honest, probably not.
Okay.
This is a place where the coaching end of it starts to play a role. Like the old rationale, I actually like, this is the biggest event of the year for athletes. I want to be on that line as a
Yeah,
coach. And it was really weird this year, like when it matters, right? Like a race like Javelina, I can go race my athletes and then just turn down a golden ticket, which
sure.
is my current plan. Unless somebody that's been mean to me is in third place, in which case I'll take it. Don't tell anybody I said that.
Taken.
Don't tell anybody I said that. Zach, that's just for you. That's just for you. Don't tell anybody I said that. That's the wrong energy. And one thing I learned after Western
We'll cut
States.
that out.
No, you can keep it in. You can keep it in. But I learned after Western States that I think because it was public, because anyone who's been public, including Zach, you get a ton of this, I'm sure. I haven't seen it, but everybody does. You get like a lot of noise. A lot of it is mean. And the tendency is to like push back. I mean, not push back like online, but to be like, this is fuel. I'm going to use this for energy. And that shit does not work for me. I am not competitive enough.
Okay.
I am not fiery enough. I need to be all love all the time.
That's interesting.
That was a joke.
I always say I don't have any evidence for this, but I think like that's a lever you can pull. But if you find yourself pulling that lever for a lot of your motivation, it's going to end badly for you eventually. So sometimes I think like maybe
yeah.
5 to 10% hate in there maybe could help you get to the finish line a little quicker.
The thing is, for me, it does, that sort of thing helps you get out the door, especially like training's hard. And I love David Goggins and like what he says a lot of the time. And that type of mindset for me really does help training sometimes. Like it's hard, right? Like, but does not help performance. I'm not competitive enough. Because the thing is, when I'm actually out there, I'm like, we're all in this together. Yeah, it's just it's bad for me. So yeah, it's bad for me. Also, I think it's bad for the sport. So my goal is to be all love all the time forever, unless I make a really like mediocre joke on a podcast, perhaps.
No, I think you're doing a good job of living that ethos.
Yeah, or unless there's a low carb study I need to debunk.
Then the angry David comes out.
Yeah, not angry, just like disappointed.
The harsh David.
Disappointed. Like, and in conclusion, like especially if there are low carb proponents listening to this, I actually love what you're doing, and I think it's incredibly important. I think all these studies have shown really interesting things that have changed the way I think about it and the way I train slightly. I just think when it comes to performance and adaptation, perhaps, but that is the place where I just want to push this message out. And the reason I immediately jumped at the chance to do this podcast, aside from loving Zach, like I haven't done podcasts recently, is because if 10 people listening to this are willing to give this a try, like at low levels that they haven't done before, and they just feel better than they ever have before, that's a cool role to have in the sport, is just helping somebody feel like enjoy it a little bit more, where running doesn't feel like this foreign thing as much anymore.
Yeah. Personally, I just don't like the idea that someone would get themselves painted into a corner and feeling like they can't be curious because they had committed to something that's at the end of the day not something you need to commit to. It's like you can try, like when I first did low carb, my thought was, well, I can try this, and if it doesn't work, I can just go back to high carb. And I ended up doing it for 14 years, but now I'm in that exact same spot where I'm like, I can try this and I can always go back. It's not once I leave, I can't come back in. I hate that sort of mindset. I think the idea of looking at these things as all like tools to be able to play around with if you want to, but yeah, you should be reasonable about it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
How
like
many
the
times
open-mindedness side.
how many times do you change your mind is always a great question to understand, like any thinker in any space. If you're not seeing them change their mind and get the pushback as a result, that's a problem, right? And
Yeah.
then the reality is that a lot of people in the fitness influencer coach space, they rarely change their mind publicly, which is not good. That goes with political thinkers or
Yeah.
basically anybody. Like, you want, not like wholesale, but some. Like for me, the big one that just happened was heat suit. Like clearly the studies are pointing to a future with heat suit. And I was like, all right, what if this is like high carb? And the studies are pointing to it, but it just hasn't been fully explored. And I went off and got fucked. And I'm open about that now. Like I'm still right. It's not, I was probably wrong about that one. And maybe it would have worked for others, or maybe it would have worked in other
Mhm.
contexts. But yeah, Killian tried the same experiment and seemed to work out for him. I just wish I was Killian, apparently.
Don't we all?
Don't we all? Chugging olive oil to get through podcasts.
Yeah. Awesome. David, I'm excited to see what you do at Javelina. Do you think you'll do Leadville again? Are you going to go for a sub 15 or something like that? That's getting close. You're getting really
Yeah.
low into the
Yeah, I mean, I
50s.
think it depends if Megan does it. If Megan does it, I'll support her. If not, maybe I would love to go back to Leadville every year, but I also I kind of want to go to other hundreds with course records and just take shots at them. I love that,
Yeah.
taking a big shot at those types of things. And sometimes the shots don't go in. And maybe my goal for next year is to fail a little bit bigger, which would be pretty big. So we'll see what that entails.
I'm excited to follow along. I'm sure you'll have great races mixed in with any failures that tend to pop
Yeah.
up, but I really
Let's hope
appreciate your time and sharing your insight.
Javelina isn't 100 degrees again, because dude, that course record, now that course record is going to get smashed. Well, not by me necessarily, by somebody. Like the
If you get
sport.
an 80-degree day, like a low 80-degree day with a cloud like comes over, because sometimes
Oh,
some years that'll happen, like a cloud will
yeah.
drift over like on those middle laps, and you'll just be like have this little bit of relief that's normally not there, and yeah, you'll be ripping at that point.
Yeah, whether it's me or somebody else. Like I was always saying, I'm gonna sign up for Javelina every year that I have left in my like peak
Until
performance
they
career.
get that day.
One, because it's the most fun race ever. It's like a party. But two,
It's
because
so much fun.
the week before last year, it was 72 or something. It's like you get that
Mhm.
day on that course, and it would be such an interesting physiological experiment. Talk about a science experiment. And everybody do your, I don't know, cool weather dance for whatever date Javelina is, because I think whether it's me or somebody else, like I think if I was in the field, it'll pull the field a little, because
For sure.
you won't have an option to go out slow. But if I blow up like Western states, like I hope that, and
People
whether
out
it's me or
there.
somebody else, like I just want to see what humans are capable of. That's my new goal, whether it's through coaching or pulling a field forward.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm excited because I love Javelina. I've loved to see how that event has grown over the years and how competitive it's gotten. And yeah, pushing that time down as far as we can get it would be exciting. So be cheering for you in October.
Hell yeah. You're the best, Zach. Just love what you're doing. It's the coolest thing for the sport, and love what you're doing with high carb here too, and balancing and the nuanced understanding of how all of this can work together. So thanks for everything.
Perfect. Before I let you go, you want to share where people can find you?
Oh, everywhere. No, Some Work All Play
Everywhere.
podcast. Yeah, go to the Some Work
Perfect.
All
Yeah,
Play
definitely
podcast.
check out the podcast.
Yeah, and if you
Awesome,
do that,
David.
you'll know in 5 minutes whether it's for you.
Yeah. No, you'll know if you need to put it on two or on a 0.5x or if it's for you.
Yeah. No, yeah. Yeah. And I would say some people it's acquired taste. The number of times we get emails like, I listened for 2 minutes and I was like, this is not for me. And now it's all I listen to. And I'm like, okay, interesting. Didn't need the insult to start, but I will take it.
It works. It stands out. That's what you got to do
Yeah,
nowadays is stand out.
exactly. Hey, AI isn't coming for us, at least within the next 6 months, because it's a little too weird. So, yeah, maybe that's the final message. Hey, be weird, because otherwise AI will come and do whatever you're doing.
There you go. Yeah. Awesome, David. Have a great rest of the evening.
You're the best. Bye, guys.
A big thanks to Element Electrolytes, Delta G Ketones, ProBio Nutrition, and Training Peaks for supporting the podcast. I have links and promotions to these brands in the show notes, but you can also get them here. If you want to check out Element Electrolytes, head over to drinklmnt.com/HPO. That'll get you a free sample pack with your first purchase. At deltagketones.com, if you enter promo code BITTER20, you will get 20% off your next purchase. And if you go to probionutrition.com, enter promo code ENDURANCE, and that will get you 20% off your next purchase. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.